It was late summer when I decided to take a short camping trip by myself. I'd been working long hours and my head felt full all the time, so I wanted to get away from everything for a few days. I picked a small lake deep in the woods about 2 hours away from the nearest town. I'd been there once before, years ago, and I remembered the water being still and the air clean, the kind of place that felt forgotten by the rest of the world. It was quiet, private, and I liked that. The plan was simple. Drive up Friday morning, hike in by noon, set up camp near the lake, and just stay there until Sunday. I didn't bring much, just my tent, sleeping bag, food, and a few essentials. I packed my backpack neatly and made sure I had everything I needed. A hatchet, a knife, flashlight, extra batteries, a small stove, a tarp, rope, and a can of bear spray. I wasn't too worried about wildlife, but I didn't want to take chances either. I left early that morning. The sun was barely up and the road was empty. I rolled down the window and breathed in the cool air as I drove north. The farther I went, the more the world thinned out. Fewer cars, fewer houses, until there was nothing but trees on both sides of the road. The last part was a narrow dirt road, rough and uneven, twisting through dense pine woods. I had to drive slow to avoid hitting potholes or scraping the underside of my car. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was high. I parked on the side, checked the map, and started walking. The trail wasn't marked well, just an old path worn down by time and maybe a few hunters. The air smelled like pine needles and damp soil. The woods were quiet except for the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional sound of a bird. After about an hour, I could hear the faint trickle of water. When I stepped out of the trees, the lake appeared before me, calm, wide, surrounded by thick forest. The water reflected the trees perfectly, so clear it almost looked like glass. I found a flat patch of ground a few hundred feet from the shoreline and started setting up my camp. I laid down the tarp first, then pitched my small two-person tent on top of it. I stacked firewood near a circle of stones that looked like an old fire pit, maybe left by other campers. I filtered water from the lake, filled my bottle, and set out my folding chair. The sun was warm, and for a moment everything felt peaceful, exactly the kind of silence I'd been craving. I spent the first few hours exploring the area. The lake wasn't big, but there were small inlets and marshy patches where frogs croaked and dragonflies hovered. I found animal tracks near the edge, deer, raccoon, maybe fox, but nothing larger. There were also signs of old camps, bits of charcoal, and even a broken fishing pole half buried in the dirt. By late afternoon, I made a small fire and cooked a simple meal. I ate slowly, watching the lake turn orange as the sun lowered behind the trees. The air cooled fast, and soon the first mosquitoes started buzzing around me. I threw a bit more wood on the fire and wrapped myself in my jacket. As night fell, the woods changed. The sound shifted from birds to crickets, from wind to small cracks in the brush. It's strange how different everything feels once it's dark. The trees seemed closer, the air thicker. I could hear things moving in the distance, probably animals foraging, but it made me uneasy. I kept the fire burning bright and tried not to think too much. When I finally crawled into my tent, I zipped the flap and lay on my back, listening. The forest outside was alive with tiny noises. Leaves rustling, twigs snapping, distant splashes from the lake. I tried to tell myself it was all normal, but there was something about being completely alone in a place that made every sound feel personal. It's like the silence was waiting for something to happen. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire outside had died down to a faint orange glow. The air inside the tent was cold. I couldn't tell why I woke up, but I had the feeling that something had disturbed me. I lay still listening. Then I heard it. A slow, steady crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Not far, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. They weren't animal sounds. They were heavier, spaced apart like a person walking carefully. I froze. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and all I could hear was my heartbeat. I waited. Nothing. Then, another soft crunch from a different spot, closer to the lake. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I knew the rhythm of those steps. They were too deliberate. For a long time I just lay there staring up at the dark roof of my tent, barely breathing. Eventually the sounds faded away and I must have drifted back to sleep. The next morning I got out early. The air was crisp and the sun just starting to rise. I walked around the edge of my campsite looking for prints or any sign of what I'd heard. The ground near my tent was covered in pine needles, so it was hard to tell, but near the lake I found faint marks in the wet dirt. Boot prints. They were deep, like someone had been standing there for a while. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't mine. I could tell by the tread pattern. Someone had been there. I tried to convince myself it was from before I arrived, maybe left by another camper days ago. But the edges were sharp, not weathered. They were fresh. I felt uneasy the rest of the morning. I kept scanning the woods while I boiled water for coffee. Nothing moved out there, but it felt like the trees were hiding something. I decided to stay anyway. I'd come here to clear my head, and I wasn't going to let one bad night ruin it. By afternoon, I went for a long hike around the lake. The path was uneven and full of fallen branches, but I kept going until I reached the far side where the trees thinned out. I found a small clearing that looked like it had been used recently. Some ashes, a few crushed beer cans, and what looked like a burnt log. I knelt down and touched the ashes. Still a little soft, maybe a few days old. Whoever had camped there must have been the same person who left those boot prints, maybe a hunter or someone fishing illegally. I figured that was it, and that gave me some comfort. I didn't think much of it after that. When I got back to camp, the sky was overcast. The lake looked darker now, rippling with wind. I cooked dinner early and sat near the fire again. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air felt heavy, like a storm might come, but the sky was clear. I stayed up late feeding the fire, staring into the dark trees. The light only reached so far. Beyond it was just black. I eventually went into my tent and zipped it shut. I must have lain there for an hour before I started drifting off. Then it happened again. The sound, soft steps in the dirt, slow, careful. My eyes opened instantly. I held my breath listening. This time they were closer. I could tell they were circling my camp, moving from one side to the other. I reached for my flashlight, switched it on, and pointed it at the wall of the tent. The light cast faint shadows through the fabric, but I couldn't see anything outside. I sat still, waiting. Then I heard the sound of metal. A light clink, like something tapping my cooking pot. My throat tightened. Whoever it was, they were in my camp now. I wanted to yell or make noise, but I didn't. I just waited, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The steps moved again, slower now, near the fire pit, then toward my tent. I could hear the soft rustle of fabric as something brushed against the outer edge of the tent wall. Then silence. Minutes passed. I didn't move. Eventually I heard the faintest crunch again, moving away, back toward the trees. The sound faded until it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I waited for the first hint of dawn before I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Everything looked the same, but something felt off. I stepped out carefully, flashlight still in hand. My firewood pile had been disturbed. A few sticks were scattered around. My small metal pan was upside down in the dirt. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. My backpack, which I had hung from a low branch, was lying on the ground. The straps had been cut clean through, not torn. Cut. I ran my fingers along the edge, smooth and deliberate, like with a knife. I checked inside. Some food was missing and one of my water bottles was gone. Everything else was still there, but the fact that someone had been close enough to cut through my gear while I slept made my skin crawl. That was the moment I decided I was leaving. I packed fast, skipping breakfast. The woods felt wrong now. I could feel eyes on me even though I didn't see anyone. I scanned the tree line every few seconds as I took down my tent. The forest was silent. By mid-morning I was hiking back toward my car. I didn't stop or rest. My pack felt heavier even though I had less in it. The air felt thick. After about 40 minutes I noticed something strange. The path didn't look right. I stopped and checked the map. Somehow I drifted off the main trail. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but I couldn't find the point where I'd gone wrong. Everything looked the same. Trees, brush, rocks. I tried to stay calm. I knew I wasn't far from where I'd camped, maybe a mile at most. I could just backtrack and find my way again. But when I turned around, I froze. There was movement in the distance between the trees. A figure, not close enough to see clearly, but definitely a person. Standing still, watching, I felt my chest tighten. I didn't move. The person didn't either. Just standing there, half hidden by the trees. I blinked, and they were gone. Just gone. I turned and started walking. I went camping alone once in a place I didn't know much about. It was a random spot I picked on a map, somewhere deep in the northern woods where there weren't many people or marked trails. I had been looking for quiet, a place away from everything, away from traffic, people, noise, and phone signals. I drove for hours, crossing small back roads that narrowed until they looked more like animal paths than anything man-made. When I finally parked my truck, the forest around me felt like it had swallowed the world whole. It was the middle of summer, but the trees were so thick that barely any sunlight reached the ground. The forest floor was dark and damp, covered with wet leaves that never seemed to dry. I remember the smell, the kind of mix between soil, pine, and something faintly rotten underneath it all. I wasn't sure if it was a dead animal nearby or just the smell of decay that hangs in old forests. I had packed light. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a hatchet, and a small cooler with food. I hiked about 2 miles into the woods before setting up camp near a narrow stream. The water looked clean, running fast over smooth stones, and I decided to stay there. It felt peaceful enough, the air heavy but calm. After I set up camp, I started gathering firewood. That's when I first noticed it. There weren't any birds singing. Usually in the woods there's always something. A distant bird call, the rustle of insects, something alive. But it was completely silent. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees, and even that felt slow, almost hesitant, like it didn't want to disturb the place. When night came, I lit a small fire and cooked a can of beans. The darkness felt different out there, heavier. The firelight barely reached beyond a few feet, and beyond that, everything faded into black. I kept telling myself it was just an ordinary forest, just trees and animals and shadows, but the silence made it hard to believe that. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears until you could hear your own heartbeat. Sometime in the night, I heard something moving in the woods behind me. It wasn't close at first, just faint crunching of leaves. I thought it might be a deer or raccoon. I stayed still, listening. The steps would stop, then start again, slow and irregular. After a few minutes, they stopped completely. I sat there staring into the trees, trying to catch any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Eventually, I went to bed. I remember waking up once during the night because I heard something brushing against the tent. It was light at first, then a small dragging sound like someone sliding a stick across the fabric. I froze, holding my breath. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I waited, listening for more, but it didn't come back. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I stepped outside to check around the tent. There were prints in the damp soil, bare footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare human feet. The prints were small, like maybe a teenager or woman. They led from the woods, circled my tent once, then went back into the trees toward the stream. My stomach turned when I saw that. I didn't know what to think. There weren't supposed to be people out here. I decided to stay alert but not panic. Maybe someone lived out there off the grid. Maybe they were just passing through. I tried to reason with myself, but something about those footprints felt wrong. They weren't walking in a straight line. They looked hesitant, scattered. Some were half-formed, like whoever made them was standing still for long periods before moving again. Later that day, while gathering more wood near the stream, I found something stuck in the mud. It was a piece of cloth, pale, torn, and soaked with dirt. It looked like part of a shirt. I didn't see any blood, but the fabric was stiff, like it had been there a while. I left it where it was. That night, I built a larger fire to keep animals away. I sat close to it, trying to stay awake. Around midnight, I started hearing something again. It wasn't footsteps this time, it was breathing. Slow, uneven breathing coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. That strange pressure you get when you know you're not alone. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The light cut through the dark in a narrow beam, hitting branches and empty spaces between them. I didn't see anything. The breathing stopped. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was condensation on the outside of my tent, and I could see a faint handprint pressed against it. I stared at it for a long time, not sure if my mind was playing tricks on me. At some point, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep near the dying fire. When I woke up, it was dawn. The forest looked softer in daylight, less threatening, but I noticed something new. The footprints were back, more of them this time circling the camp again. They weren't just around the tent, they went right up to where I had been sleeping. Whoever it was had been standing a few feet from me while I slept. I packed up my things. I decided to hike back to the truck and leave. As I started moving, I realized I didn't remember the way I came. I had marked a few trees with small cuts from my hatchet, but now I couldn't find any of them. I must have walked in the wrong direction. The deeper I went, the more unfamiliar everything looked. The trees all started to look the same, like a repeating pattern. Hours passed and I still couldn't find the road or the sound of any cars. I had a compass with me, so I kept heading west, figuring I'd hit something eventually. But the forest seemed endless. Around afternoon, I came across an area that looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. There were several shallow holes half filled with leaves and mud. Some were small, others wide enough to lie down in. The air smelled strange there, like wet metal and rot. I didn't look too closely into the holes, but I could tell something had been buried and dug up multiple times. There were broken branches, pieces of rope, and more scraps of dirty fabric. I backed away and kept walking. As evening came, I found a small clearing with an old campsite. The remains of a fire pit, some broken bottles, and a rusted metal pot. Nearby, hanging from a tree branch, was something that made my chest tighten. It was a piece of camping gear, the same brand as mine. Same model, even the same color. I didn't know if someone had lost it or if it was something left behind on purpose. That night I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark, clutching my hatchet, too scared to sleep. Every few minutes I heard movement in the trees. Sometimes it sounded far, sometimes close. Once I thought I saw a shape move between the trees, a figure standing still. I could barely make it out, but it was tall and thin, unmoving. I blinked and it was gone. The worst part wasn't seeing or hearing things. It was realizing how easy it would be to disappear there. No one knew where I was. I hadn't told anyone the exact spot. I could vanish and nobody would even know where to start looking. By morning, I was starving and tired. I forced myself to move. I followed the sound of running water, thinking it might lead me back to the stream where I started. After a long while, I reached it, but it wasn't the same spot. The banks were steeper, and there were no footprints this time. I refilled my bottle and sat down to rest. Then I noticed something in the mud across the stream. It looked like a tent stake. I crossed over to check, and when I got closer, I saw what it really was, a bone. Small, white, with a jagged end like it had been broken. It didn't look like an animal's. There were more scattered nearby, half buried in the soil. My chest felt tight and I started shaking. I didn't stay long after that. I moved as fast as I could, following the stream downstream. I walked until my legs ached and my throat was dry. At some point in the afternoon, I saw tire tracks through the mud. A faint road, maybe used by loggers. I followed it until I reached a clearing, and there it was. My truck right where I left it. Only something was wrong. The driver's side door was open and all my gear that I hadn't taken, spare clothes, some food, a small cooler, was gone. On the ground near the truck was a set of bare footprints. They led from the trees up to the driver's door, then back again into the woods. I got into the truck, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down. I could still feel eyes on me. I started the engine and drove as fast as the narrow road allowed. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. When I got home, I took everything out of the truck and washed it. I couldn't stand the smell of the woods anymore. It clung to everything. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just threw the camping gear away and stopped going outdoors altogether. Sometimes at night I still hear it, that soft sound of breathing, like someone standing just outside the window. I keep telling myself it's just my imagination, just memory. But every once in a while, when I go outside in the morning, I find a faint footprint in the dirt near my door, and every time it's bare. I had gone camping alone that weekend to clear my head. It was early autumn. The air was dry and cool, and the woods had that smell of fallen leaves and damp soil that I always found calming. I parked my truck along a dirt pull-off beside a faded trail marker, hiked about 2 miles in, and set up camp in a clearing surrounded by tall pine and birch. I had camped many times before, alone with friends in all kinds of weather, so I wasn't nervous. But something about that area felt off from the moment I arrived. It wasn't anything obvious. There was no strange sound, no bad weather, no sign of animals. It just felt too quiet. Even the usual forest noises, wind, rustling branches, distant birds seemed to come and go in odd patterns. It wasn't silence, but it wasn't normal either. I brushed it off. I figured maybe it was because I had been stuck in the city too long. My senses dulled by noise and concrete. Out here, everything was just sharper. I pitched my small green tent near a fallen log and gathered some firewood. I had enough supplies for 3 nights: food, water, a first aid kit, extra batteries, a small hatchet, and a .22 rifle I carried mostly for peace of mind. I built the fire just before dusk. The crackle of it finally brought some comfort, and the woods seemed a little less strange with that flickering light at my feet. By nightfall, the forest cooled fast. The air smelled clean, almost metallic. I cooked a can of beans, ate quietly, then sat watching the flames die down. The trees around me swayed gently, but there was barely a breeze. I remember staring at the firelight reflecting in my metal mug, the way it warped the shapes around it. My mind drifted between memories of work, family, and old friends. It was peaceful, until I noticed something strange. When I leaned back and looked beyond the light of the fire, I realized there was a faint orange glow between the trees, far off to my right. It wasn't a campfire, too low, too still. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, I thought. But the odd thing was how the glow seemed to flicker once and then disappear entirely. Like someone had turned off a lantern the second I noticed it. I stared into the darkness for a long time but saw nothing else. I told myself it could have been the reflection of my fire on something metallic deeper in the woods, maybe even a piece of trash or a can. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The forest seemed to lean in around me tighter somehow. Every snap of a twig in the distance made my stomach tighten. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap closed, and lay on my sleeping pad with my flashlight beside me. I didn't fall asleep quickly. I lay there listening to the faint crackle of embers outside and the occasional rustle of branches. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like soft footsteps, not close but moving slowly in the distance. It could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. I didn't move. The sound went on for a few minutes, then faded away. When I finally slept, my dreams were restless. I woke around dawn, light filtering through the tent fabric, the forest still wrapped in that pale morning mist. Everything looked normal. No sign of anyone else, no strange tracks near camp. I shook it off again, made coffee, and set out for a short hike. The trail I followed was faint, winding through thick underbrush. I carried only a small day pack and marked my path with bits of bright orange tape I tied to branches every few hundred feet. The woods felt endless, quiet, shadowed, the trees close together. After about an hour, I noticed an old overgrown logging road cutting through the forest. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The deeper I went, the stranger it felt. The air was colder here, the light dimmer. I passed rotting tree stumps and rusted metal scraps half buried in the dirt. Then I saw what looked like the remains of a hunting blind, half collapsed on a small ridge. I climbed up and looked around. From that higher spot, I could see a stretch of open land through the trees, an old clearing maybe once used by loggers. In the middle of it was a pile of something dark. I went closer, expecting trash or wood debris, but when I got near, I saw they were animal remains. Several deer carcasses, old and decaying, arranged almost in a heap, bones picked clean, rib cages cracked open. Some looked fresh, others just piles of bones. I stepped back slowly, my stomach twisting. This wasn't a natural kill site. The animals hadn't just died there. They had been brought there. I felt eyes on me, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The woods were still dead quiet. I scanned the trees, hand hovering near my pack where my small hatchet was clipped. Nothing moved. But the smell, a sour metallic stink, hung heavy in the air. I left quickly, retracing my orange markers. Every sound behind me felt deliberate, like soft movement just out of sight. When I got back to camp, I packed up some of my gear, just in case I decided to leave early. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a poacher's dump site. Illegal hunting wasn't rare in these woods, but something about the way those carcasses were placed bothered me deeply. They weren't scattered or dragged. They were piled, almost stacked. The day passed slowly. I didn't eat much. I spent most of the afternoon sitting near the fire pit, trying to keep my mind off that scene. I watched the forest carefully, scanning for any movement. Around sunset, I noticed something again. A faint sound far off, like metal hitting metal. Not loud, just a single dull clank, then silence. It happened again an hour later, closer this time. It came from the same direction as that orange glow I'd seen the first night. I stood still for a long time, waiting. The sound didn't repeat. I didn't see any light, just darkness between the trees. That night was worse. I stayed awake long after the fire burned out, flashlight in hand. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again, the sound of movement. But this time it was close. Slow, steady footsteps, breaking twigs, crushing leaves. Not the light steps of an animal, heavier. I held my breath. The steps stopped somewhere near the edge of camp. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls. Then faintly I heard a soft thud, like something being dropped onto the ground. I froze. Minutes passed. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I turned off my flashlight and listened in the dark. There was a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped completely. I didn't move again until the first light of morning. When I stepped outside, the air was cold, my breath visible. The ground near the edge of camp was disturbed. Fresh dirt turned up. I followed it a few feet and saw something that made my stomach drop. A deer head. Cleanly cut, eyes clouded, lying upright in the dirt. It hadn't been there the day before. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. Maybe hunters trying to scare me off. But that didn't make sense. No one camps miles off trail just to pull a prank like that. And whoever did it had been there last night, only a few yards from where I slept. I packed up in under 20 minutes. I didn't even eat. I threw my gear into my pack, stomped out the fire, and started down the path toward my truck. My hands shook as I tied my rifle strap over my shoulder. Every sound behind me made me turn. The forest seemed alive with tiny noises. Twigs snapping, faint breathing wind, but I saw nothing. When I reached the logging road again, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My orange trail markers were gone. Every single one. The bits of tape I had tied to trees the day before were missing. I looked around, realizing the forest suddenly looked unfamiliar. The shapes of the trees, the angle of light, it was all wrong. I had been careful to follow the same direction, but now I couldn't tell where I was. I tried to backtrack, but it was useless. The terrain all looked the same. The panic crept in slowly, not sharp at first, just a sinking feeling in my stomach. I checked my compass and tried heading east, knowing the road should be somewhere in that direction. But the more I walked, the thicker the woods became. An hour passed, then 2. I was sweating despite the cold air. I stopped to rest near a large fallen log. As I sat, I noticed a strange pattern in the dirt beside me. Footprints. Human. Barefoot. The impressions were deep, adult-sized, and fresh. The dirt around them was still slightly damp, as if pressed just minutes ago. I stood up and backed away, scanning the trees. My throat felt dry. There was no sound. Not even birds. The forest had gone completely still again. I didn't linger. I started walking faster, ignoring the compass, just trying to find any sign of an old trail or clearing. By late afternoon, I finally reached a slope that looked familiar. The sun was setting behind the trees, and through a break in the branches, I spotted what looked like the roof of my truck in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I half ran down the slope, stumbling over rocks and roots. When I reached the truck, I saw something that froze me in place. There were deep scratches along the driver's side door, 5 long, deliberate gouges cut into the metal. They were too high to be from an animal. My back window was cracked. On the ground beside the truck lay another deer bone. Clean white, placed carefully upright like someone had set it there. I didn't waste another second. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove without stopping. I didn't look back once. When I reached the nearest gas station 40 minutes later, I got out to check the truck again in the light. The scratches were real, deep enough to see the metal underneath the paint. My hands were still shaking as I filled the tank. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not the Rangers, not my friends. I went camping alone deep in the northern woods that weekend because I wanted to clear my head. I had been working nonstop for months, sleeping poorly, eating worse, and my body felt heavy and restless at the same time. The woods had always been a kind of therapy for me. Just trees, dirt, and air so clean it made your lungs ache a little. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a flashlight, a knife, and some water bottles. I left my phone in my truck, locked it, and walked almost 4 miles into the forest before I stopped. I didn't want to hear engines or see headlights. I just wanted silence. The air that evening was still and thick with the smell of pine sap and damp soil. The ground under my boots was soft from a week of rain, and every few steps my shoes sank slightly into the mud. I found a clearing next to a small stream that ran between 2 thick ridges of rock. It was a perfect spot, flat, quiet, sheltered from the wind. The only sounds were the soft trickle of the stream and the faint clicks of insects hidden in the moss. Setting up my tent took about 15 minutes. I gathered some dry sticks and bark from under a fallen log, made a small fire, and heated one of the cans. The light from the flames bounced off the wet leaves around me, making everything seem alive. I sat there for a long time, just staring into the fire, listening to the forest breathing around me. There's something strange about the woods at night, the way silence feels heavy, like a blanket pressing against your ears. As it got darker, the fire became the only source of light and the shadows thickened. Every now and then I'd hear a distant crack, wood splitting, or maybe something stepping on fallen branches far off. It didn't bother me at first. Forests make those sounds all the time. But after a while, it felt like the noises were getting closer. Not steady footsteps, but random crunches. One, then nothing for a while, then another, a little nearer. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon. When I finally crawled into my tent, the fire had burned down to embers. The air had cooled sharply and condensation was forming on the inside of the fabric. I laid there on my back, my sleeping bag zipped up to my chest, staring at the faint outline of the tent ceiling above me. The night was black. I couldn't see my own hand. The stream outside made a steady, low sound, and the forest was otherwise quiet except for the occasional sigh of wind. Sometime later, I don't know how long, I woke up. I didn't move at first, just opened my eyes and tried to figure out what had woken me. The sound was faint but sharp. A metallic clink, then a dragging noise. It came from outside, maybe a few feet from the tent. It didn't sound like an animal this time. It sounded deliberate, like something metal being pulled slowly across stone. I stayed completely still. The sound stopped. I could hear my heart in my ears. Then it started again, even closer. The drag of something heavy. The crunch of soil being disturbed. I held my breath and waited, every muscle locked. I told myself it could be a branch sliding down a rock, maybe something knocked loose by the wind. But there was no wind. The trees were perfectly still. It went quiet again. Minutes passed. I tried to convince myself to unzip the tent and check, but I couldn't move. I just lay there staring into the darkness. Then something brushed the side of the tent. It wasn't hard, just a faint touch that made the thin fabric ripple slightly. I froze. The sound came again, a slow glide along the side like someone dragging a hand or a stick along the nylon. My breathing was shallow and loud in my ears. Then I heard footsteps, slow, careful on the damp ground. One step, then another. They stopped right outside near my head. I could hear the soft sound of breathing now. My own heartbeat felt so loud I thought it would give me away. The air inside the tent was hot and suffocating, but I didn't dare move. I waited for the zipper to move or the tent to shake again, but after a while the sound faded. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep again that night. I just waited for light. Every minute felt like an hour. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, I unzipped the tent and crawled out. The first thing I noticed was the mud around the tent. There were prints, boot prints, clear and heavy. Not animal tracks. They went in a half circle around my tent, stopping on one side and starting again a few feet away, like whoever it was had been circling. The mud was churned near where my fire had been. My backpack was there, but it was open. My knife, which I had kept near the entrance, was gone. I checked the trees nearby, the edge of the stream, the slope of the ridge, but there was nothing else. No movement, no sign of anyone. I followed the boot prints for a while until they disappeared into the forest floor, where pine needles covered the mud. The realization that someone had been there, standing right outside my tent while I slept, hit me like a wave of nausea. I packed up fast. The sun was barely up when I started back toward the trail. The woods looked different in the daylight, less peaceful, more watchful. Every sound made me turn my head. Halfway back, I found something that made my stomach twist. There was a small piece of cloth caught on a broken branch. It was red, stiff with dried mud. A few feet beyond it, hidden in the brush, I saw a metal can, an empty food can, the same brand as mine. But it wasn't one I'd eaten. The top had been cut jaggedly open, not with a regular can opener, but like it had been pried open with a knife. The edges were sharp and uneven. I left it there and kept walking. My legs were burning, but I didn't stop until I saw the dirt road where my truck was parked. When I reached it, the sight made my chest tighten. My driver's side door was open. I hadn't left it like that. My first thought was that someone broke in, but when I checked, nothing was missing. My phone was still in the glove compartment. My keys were still where I left them, but on the seat was my missing knife, lying across a folded piece of paper. The paper was blank except for a single muddy fingerprint near the top. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. I don't know if it was a warning or a joke, but it was enough to make me never go back to those woods again. I drove away fast, checking my mirrors constantly. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about the sound I had heard outside my tent. The slow, steady breathing, the careful steps, the way they stopped right next to my head. Whoever that was, they hadn't just stumbled onto my campsite. They'd been watching me, maybe from the moment I started that fire. It took me a long time to go camping again, and when I finally did, I stayed close to other people. I never went off trail, never left my car out of sight. Every noise after dark put me on edge. Even now, years later, sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear that faint dragging sound, metal against stone, and it brings back that same cold feeling in my chest. I think about how easily things could have gone differently. If I'd gone out of the tent that night, if I'd confronted whoever was there, or if I hadn't woken up at all, the thought of it follows me. Somewhere out there in those woods, there's a person who moves quietly, waits patiently and watches campers sleep. And the worst part is knowing that they didn't take anything. They didn't want my stuff. They wanted me to know they'd been there. I went camping alone in early September, thinking it would be peaceful before the cold started to set in. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, somewhere quiet where I wouldn't see anyone else for days. I drove up a narrow dirt road that wound through thick pine forest, branches brushing the side of my truck as I climbed higher. It was the kind of road that felt forgotten, rutted and uneven, with moss growing in the middle of the tracks. I passed no cars, no cabins, no signs of anyone living out there. That was exactly what I wanted. Just space, silence, and the woods. When I finally stopped, the forest around me felt still in a strange way. There was no wind. Even the birds were quiet. The air smelled like wet soil and pine sap, and everything had that faint dampness that lingers in high mountain forests. I parked beside a clearing that sloped slightly downward, just big enough for my tent and a fire ring. A narrow stream ran maybe 30 yards away, behind a wall of ferns and deadfall. I set up camp slowly, making sure everything was perfect. The tent facing the stream, the food sealed, firewood stacked in a neat pile. It was one of those warm, golden afternoons where time felt slow. The sun dropped behind the ridge earlier than I expected, though, and the woods darkened fast. By the time I lit the fire, the trees around the clearing were already black silhouettes. That first night was fine. I sat by the fire, cooked a small meal, and listened to the occasional branch snapping in the forest. That sound never bothered me much. Forests are full of animals that move at night. Still, there was something about how far those sounds carried that made me uneasy. It wasn't loud. It was distant. But every time something shifted out there, I caught myself glancing up. When I finally crawled into the tent, the silence hit harder. Without the fire crackling, I realized how dark it really was. I couldn't see my own hand unless I turned on my flashlight. I laid there listening, the soft gurgle of the stream, a few insects, then nothing. It was too quiet. I remember rolling over a few times, trying to sleep, and then hearing what sounded like a single, faint footstep. Just one. It came from somewhere behind my tent, near the stream. I froze and listened. Nothing after that. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or maybe a raccoon stepping on dry leaves. I kept still for a long time, then finally fell asleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. I walked down to the stream, filled a bottle with water, and noticed fresh impressions in the mud near the bank. Not clear footprints, but something that had pressed down the soft soil in a long shape, like a boot heel dragged slightly. I crouched and stared at it for a minute, telling myself it could have been my own print from yesterday. But it was facing toward the tent, not away. That day I hiked a few miles deeper into the woods. The trail was faint, if you could even call it a trail. Fallen logs, patches of ferns, uneven ground. The forest felt endless. I didn't see a single person, but at one point I found an old fire ring made of stones, half collapsed, with a few rusted tin cans scattered nearby. It looked abandoned for years. I sat there for a while eating, just listening to the quiet again. The air started to shift around mid-afternoon. The forest went silent again, the same way it had the day before. Not even birds. I didn't like that. You spend enough time in the woods and you start to feel when something's off. It wasn't just silence, it was the kind that feels heavy, like the trees themselves are holding their breath. I decided to head back early. When I reached my camp, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The firewood pile I'd stacked neatly was scattered like someone had kicked it apart. I stood there staring at it, trying to think if maybe an animal had done it. But animals don't usually toss wood around like that. My tent flap was closed, though, and nothing seemed missing. I forced myself to shrug it off. That night I built the fire higher than before. The light pushed deeper into the trees, but it also made the edges of the clearing feel darker. I kept glancing at those edges while eating, like something was standing just outside the light. At one point I swore I saw movement, a dark shape between the trees, but when I stared directly at it, it was gone. I sat there for a long time, fire crackling, the hair on the back of my neck standing up for no reason I could explain. Eventually, I put out the fire and went into the tent. Laying there, I could hear the wind picking up now, soft at first, brushing through the trees. I started to relax, listening to that. Then I heard another sound. It was faint, but clear enough to know it wasn't the wind. It was breathing. Slow, uneven breathing coming from just outside the tent wall. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tightening. I could feel my heart beat against the sleeping bag. The breathing continued for maybe 5-6 seconds. Then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't even open my eyes. I laid there until the sky started to lighten and the birds returned. When I finally crawled out, the first thing I did was check the ground. There were fresh impressions again, this time clearer. Boot prints. Not mine. Larger. Heavy tread. Someone had been there. That realization hit me like ice. I packed up fast, every noise in the forest making me jump. But when I started to leave, I saw something farther down the slope, maybe 50 yards away, near the trees. Something that looked like a tarp. I don't even know why I went to check. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tarp. It was an old sleeping bag, half buried under leaves. It was dirty, faded red, and there were torn clothes scattered around it. I picked up a shirt. It was stiff, like it had been left out through rain after rain. But what caught me was the smell. Old rot, like something that had been wet too long. I looked around and saw more, small piles of trash, a dented metal cup, a broken lantern. Someone had lived there. Not recently, but long enough to leave a trace. I turned back toward my camp, and that's when I noticed something else. A faint trail leading uphill behind my tent. I hadn't seen it before, but now that I was looking for it, it was there. Flattened grass, a narrow line disappearing into the trees. I followed it slowly, just a few yards. The trees closed in tight overhead, the air cooler. I could see where branches had been cut, small areas cleared. Someone had been using that spot, maybe watching my camp from the woods. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't stay another night. I packed everything in a hurry and started back down the mountain road. The whole drive out, I kept checking my mirrors. The feeling that someone was behind me wouldn't go away. Halfway down, I stopped near a bend, where there was a small clearing, and looked back up the slope. From there, I could see the faint line of smoke rising through the trees, right from the area where my camp had been. Someone was there after I left. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over at a gas station, still shaking. I told myself it was fine, that I'd just been paranoid. But when I went to grab a drink inside, I saw a bulletin board by the door with a few missing person flyers. One caught my eye, someone who'd vanished last fall while camping in the same area I'd just been. The photo showed a man maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket. I stared at it for a long time. There was something about the face that looked familiar. Then I realized why. The shape of his boot in the picture, heavy tread, same pattern I'd seen by my tent. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep right. I'd wake up thinking I heard that slow breathing again. I threw away most of my camping gear. Couldn't even look at it without my chest tightening. Every time I drove past a forest line, I'd glance toward the trees, half expecting to see movement. Months later, I read a short local article online about an old campsite discovered deep in those woods. Bones found near a sleeping bag identified as a hiker who'd gone missing 2 years before. They said he might have died from exposure or injury, but I knew that wasn't right. There was something else out there. Someone else. I still think about the prints, the breathing, and the smoke that rose after I left. Whoever was up there knew I'd been there. Maybe they'd been watching for a long time. And the worst part is, I'll never know if they're still there, waiting for whoever sets up camp next. I went camping alone once in a remote area of northern Montana. It wasn't my first time being out there by myself, but it was the farthest I had ever gone from any real town. I wanted to be away from everything. No cell service, no people, just woods, silence, and time to clear my head. I picked a place that wasn't even marked on most maps. A section of forest where the trees grew thick and old, where you could walk for hours without seeing a trail marker. The air out there always had that cold, damp weight that clung to everything, even in summer. The smell of pine and soil seemed to seep into my skin. It took almost 6 hours of rough driving on old forest roads before I reached the spot I had marked on my GPS weeks before. From there, I had to hike another 3 miles into the woods. The trail disappeared after the first mile. I could hear nothing but the sound of my boots crushing twigs and the faint hum of mosquitoes around my ears. Every now and then I'd stop and just listen. The silence out there wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. You could almost feel it pressing in, like the forest was holding its breath. By the time I found a clearing flat enough to set up my tent, the light was fading. The ground was soft and smelled like wet leaves. I unpacked everything slowly, taking my time to drive the stakes deep into the soil. I built a small fire using dry branches I had gathered earlier. The flames flickered weakly at first, then caught, throwing light over the trunks of the surrounding trees. Their shadows stretched long and thin, swaying with every gust of wind. That first night was calm. I sat by the fire eating canned chili straight from the tin and watching sparks drift up into the dark. There was something about being that deep in the woods that made even small noises sound huge. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush. It made my heart jump for a second before I reminded myself it was probably just an animal. I had seen deer tracks on my way in. Maybe elk, maybe even a bear, though I tried not to think about that too much. When I finally crawled into my tent, I lay there for a long time listening. The forest creaked and shifted, trees rubbing against each other somewhere out in the dark. I must have fallen asleep around midnight, but I woke up sometime later to a strange sound. It wasn't an animal sound. It was rhythmic, something that almost sounded like footsteps. Slow, careful, like someone stepping on leaves and stopping every few seconds. It came from behind my tent, just far enough that I couldn't tell what direction it was moving in. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed still, barely breathing, staring up at the roof of the tent. The sound stopped for a long moment, and I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe a branch had fallen. Then I heard it again, this time closer. Crunch, pause, crunch. My hands were shaking. I reached quietly for the small hatchet I kept by my sleeping bag. The sound stopped again. I didn't move. I just listened. After a few minutes, there was nothing. No steps, no wind, just that same thick silence. Eventually, I forced myself to believe it was an animal sniffing around and went back to sleep, though I never really rested after that. In the morning, I walked around the tent. The ground was damp, covered in fallen leaves. There were footprints, but not animal ones. Human ones, bare feet. I could see the shape of toes pressed into the mud. The prints went around the back of my tent and disappeared into the trees. I just stood there for a long time, staring at them. My mind was racing. I hadn't heard another car, hadn't seen any sign of people for miles. Whoever it was had walked through miles of wilderness barefoot. That didn't make sense. I told myself maybe it was an old print. Maybe someone had camped there before and I hadn't noticed. I tried to convince myself of that all morning. I cooked breakfast, hiked around the nearby creek and gathered more wood, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Every time I looked into the trees, it felt like someone was looking back. The forest felt different now, colder, heavier, like the silence had teeth. That evening, I decided to keep the fire going all night. I sat up longer than usual, tossing wood on every time it started to fade. The flames gave me something to focus on. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement again, this time from further out in the woods. It was faint but steady. The crunch of leaves, then silence, then the faintest crack of a branch snapping. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't move for almost an hour, just sat there staring into the dark. At some point, I turned my headlamp toward the trees, sweeping it slowly. The light caught something between the trunks, a shape that didn't belong. I froze. It looked like a piece of fabric hanging from a branch, pale and torn. I walked closer, step by step, until I saw what it was. A shredded t-shirt hanging on a low branch, stained dark with something old and brown. I didn't touch it. I turned around and walked straight back to my camp, every step feeling heavier than the last. That was when I decided I'd leave the next morning. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those barefoot prints circling my tent again. I kept the hatchet close, my ears tuned to every sound. Around 3 a.m. I heard something again, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was a faint dragging sound. Something moving slowly across the ground. It was coming from the same direction where I had seen the shirt. The fire had burned down low, just glowing coals now. I didn't move. The sound got closer, then stopped. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. Then there was a new sound, soft, almost like breathing, but not mine. It was outside, maybe 10 feet away. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out and threw a big piece of wood onto the fire. The flames jumped high again, lighting up the trees. For a second, I thought I saw someone, just a figure between the trees standing still. But the light shifted and it was gone. I stayed up until dawn, watching the woods. Nothing else moved. As soon as the first light touched the trees, I packed everything. I didn't even eat. I just shoved my gear into my pack and started walking. My nerves were shot. Every sound made me turn around. The woods felt endless. The air was cold and sharp, and my hands were shaking the whole time. I followed my GPS, but halfway through the hike back, I realized something was wrong. The path didn't look familiar. I checked the map again. The coordinates were right, but I couldn't find the same trail I'd used to come in. The forest all looked the same now, just trees, shadows, and endless green. I tried to stay calm. I knew how easy it was to get turned around in dense woods, so I just kept walking in what I thought was the right direction. After an hour, I found something that made my stomach twist. A campfire ring, old stones arranged in a circle. Inside were burnt pieces of wood and a half-melted tin can. Someone had camped there, but next to the fire pit I saw a small pile of bones. Animal bones, I told myself. Probably a deer or a rabbit. But then I looked closer. They weren't animal bones. They were small, thin, shaped like fingers. I stumbled back and nearly fell. My brain couldn't process it at first. They were old, maybe years old, but they were definitely human. I didn't stay to look any longer. I turned and started walking again, faster now, not even checking the GPS anymore. I just wanted out. I must have walked for hours. The sun moved across the sky and started to drop again, and I still hadn't reached my truck. My legs hurt. My throat was dry. I was losing my sense of direction. As it got darker, I saw something ahead, a tent. Not mine. It looked torn, weathered, maybe abandoned for years. The fabric was covered in moss. I almost walked past it, but something inside caught the light. I stepped closer and saw a small metal box on the ground, half buried in dirt. It was rusted, but I managed to open it. Inside were small objects. An old pocket knife, a cracked lighter, a photo folded in half. The photo showed a man standing beside a tent, smiling at the camera. Behind him was the same clearing I had camped in. I realized then that someone else had camped there before me. Someone who never left. I dropped the box and started running. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. The forest tore at me, branches scratching my arms and face. I kept moving until I saw a thin line through the trees. The road. I broke through the brush and stumbled onto it, collapsing on the gravel. My truck was parked a few hundred yards down. I had never been so happy to see it. I drove out of there without looking back. Even now, I still think about those footprints, that shredded shirt, the bones. I've read stories about people going missing in the national forests, about campsites found years later with no one around. Maybe the person who left that tent never made it out. Maybe they got lost like I almost did. Or maybe someone else found them first. I don't go camping alone anymore. Not because I'm afraid of wild animals or getting lost, but because of what else might be out there. People who don't belong, who move through those woods quietly, barefoot, waiting. I don't think I'll ever forget that sound. The slow, careful crunch of footsteps circling my tent in the dark, and the feeling that something out there was watching, patient and silent, long before I ever noticed it. I had been planning that camping trip for almost 3 months. The idea wasn't to escape anything or find peace. I just wanted to go somewhere away from everyone and everything familiar. I'd been working long hours at a warehouse, the kind of job where every shift feels the same. Heavy boxes, metal shelves, the constant drone of conveyor belts, and no real sense of time passing. My body ached every night. My eyes stung from the bright fluorescent lights. I wanted to see something natural again. I wanted silence. So I picked a random location on a map one night after work. It wasn't a known campground. It wasn't even marked as a trail. It was just a patch of green, deep forest with a river winding through it, about 40 miles from the nearest small town. I figured it was perfect. Nobody would be there. I'd have the place to myself. I packed everything carefully over a few days. I wanted to be prepared but not overloaded. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 4 days, water filter, knife, hatchet, rope, tarp, first aid kit. I'd done enough camping to know what mattered. The only mistake I made, though I didn't realize it at the time, was deciding to go alone. I left before sunrise on a Thursday. My car was filled with gear, and the air outside was cold enough that I could see my breath. The highway was empty except for the occasional truck, and the farther I drove, the thinner the traffic became. I felt better with each mile, lighter, freer. After a few hours, I turned off onto a narrow county road that twisted through miles of forest. It looked untouched. Pines crowded both sides, thick and dark, their tops swaying gently in the wind. I remember thinking how good the air smelled. Clean, sharp, with that damp, earthy scent of leaves and moss. I parked near the side of a dirt path that led into the woods. There were no signs, no trail markers, no parking area, just trees and a faint path made by someone long ago. I loaded my pack, locked the car, and started walking. At first, the woods were peaceful. The only sounds were birds and the crunch of my boots on the ground. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. After an hour, I couldn't hear cars anymore. Not that I'd heard many before. Just the low hum of wind moving through branches. I followed the faint path downhill toward where the map had shown a river. The trail grew harder to see, swallowed by ferns and roots, but I kept going, using the sun to guess direction. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks dark and rough, their branches creating a dim ceiling of green above me. It felt good. I felt isolated, almost erased. I found the river by mid-afternoon. It wasn't wide, maybe 15 feet across, but it moved fast over rocks, cold and clear. I decided to set up camp on a flat stretch about 20 yards back from the water, where the ground was mostly dry. There was a fallen log nearby that looked perfect for sitting, and enough open space to build a small fire without worrying about setting the woods alight. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time driving each stake deep into the ground. Then I gathered dry branches, broke them into pieces, and built a small fire ring from stones. The work felt good. My hands were scratched, my shirt damp with sweat, but the quiet around me made every sound stand out. The pop of branches, the faint rush of the river, the occasional rustle from somewhere behind me that always stopped before I could look. By evening, I had a small fire going. I boiled water for coffee and sat on the log watching the flames. The woods around me turned darker until the fire was the only light. I felt calm, tired but good. The first night was supposed to be about adjusting, getting used to the silence, sleeping on the ground again. When I finally crawled into the tent, I noticed how loud the forest really was at night. It wasn't city noise, but it was constant. Insects, the distant call of something across the river, the occasional cracking sound that could have been a branch or an animal moving. I told myself it was probably raccoons or deer. Nothing unusual. I zipped the tent shut and lay still, staring up at the thin fabric above me. It took me a long time to fall asleep. Every small noise felt amplified, like it was happening right next to me. Once or twice I thought I heard something move through the leaves near my camp, slow and steady. But each time I sat up and listened, it stopped. After a while, I convinced myself it was just the wind shifting through the trees. When I woke up the next morning, the air was cold and the fire had gone out. The ground outside was covered in dew, and my breath made small white clouds. I stretched, stepped outside, and started the stove for coffee. The sun was just rising through the trees, throwing thin gold light across the river. Everything looked untouched, exactly how I'd left it. After breakfast, I decided to explore upstream. I followed the river, hopping from rock to rock, sometimes walking along the bank. The farther I went, the quieter it got. I noticed there were fewer birds now, and the forest seemed older. The trees were thicker, their trunks black with age and moss. It felt different there, and still beautiful, but heavier somehow. About a mile upriver, I found something that stopped me. On the opposite bank, half hidden by brush, there was an old fire ring made of stones, almost identical to mine. It looked abandoned. The ashes were gray and cold, and the ground around it was pressed flat, as if tents had once stood there. I crossed the river carefully, my boots sinking into mud, and walked closer. There were signs someone had camped there not long ago. Not fresh, but not ancient either. A few rusted cans, the remains of a burned log, a rope still tied between two trees sagging with rot. I crouched near the ashes and touched them, dry, brittle. I guessed maybe a few months old. There was something else nearby, a torn piece of blue fabric caught in a branch, fluttering slightly in the wind. I pulled it free. It looked like part of a jacket. That alone wasn't strange. People camp everywhere. But what bothered me was how deep in the woods this was. There were no trails, no signs anyone should have been here recently. I walked a bit farther past the old site and noticed something else. Faint tire tracks. Not from a car, but maybe an ATV leading away into the woods. They were faded, barely visible, but there, I followed them a short distance until they disappeared into soft ground. The rest of the day I spent fishing, resting, and writing notes in a small book I'd brought. I told myself the old camp was nothing, just someone who'd come through months ago. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the first person to use that stretch of river. That night the forest felt different. The air was still, the fire crackled louder, and every sound seemed to carry farther. I ate dinner and sat watching the trees. As darkness settled, the silence grew deeper. I didn't realize how tense I'd become until I noticed my hands were tight around my knees. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A slow crunch of leaves, like someone stepping carefully. I froze, listening. It came from somewhere to my left, just beyond the tent. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam through the thin wall of fabric. I saw nothing. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for hours, waiting. Eventually, fatigue won. When I woke again, it was dawn. The first thing I did was check around my tent. The ground looked normal, but about 10 feet away near the edge of the trees, I found a single boot print in the mud. It wasn't mine. It was larger, deeper, and pointed toward my tent. I crouched beside it, staring at the shape, the tread, the way the edges were crisp and sharp, meaning it was fresh. I stood there for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately. But another part, the stubborn, curious part, told me it could have been left earlier by someone passing through. I told myself that again and again. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. Every small sound caught my attention. I scanned the tree line constantly, expecting to see movement. I stopped fishing. I didn't wander far. I kept the fire going all day just for comfort. By evening, I was exhausted but too uneasy to rest. The forest grew dark fast, shadows stretching long between the trees. The temperature dropped and fog started to form over the river. I sat by the fire until my eyes stung from the smoke. I didn't want to go into the tent, but eventually I had to. I zipped the door shut and lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand. My heart beat hard against my ribs. I must have drifted into a half-sleep because when I opened my eyes again, the fire outside was almost dead. The forest was silent, completely silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Then I heard it again. Slow steps, deliberate, moving closer. I could hear the weight of each one, the faint shift of leaves. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. It was paced, careful, human. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps came from the direction of the river this time, stopping just a few feet away. I could hear the soft sound of someone exhaling. Then nothing. I gripped the flashlight tighter. My mind was screaming to look, to shine the light, but my body wouldn't move. I stayed still until the silence stretched so long I began to doubt I'd heard anything at all. Finally, I switched on the flashlight and pointed it toward the tent wall. Nothing. Just the fabric, pale in the beam. When I looked outside at sunrise, I found 2 sets of prints this time, both near the riverbank. One slightly smaller than the other, both leading toward where I'd heard the sounds. The mud was soft, the impressions deep. My stomach turned cold. At that point, I knew I had to leave. It wasn't fear of something supernatural. I went camping alone last fall in a stretch of dense woods I had only seen once before. I didn't pick the place for its beauty or the trails. Honestly, I just wanted silence. I'd been feeling worn out, disconnected from everything. The plan was to spend 4 days alone with nothing but the sound of the wind and the fire. I didn't tell many people where I was going. It felt better that way. I parked my truck at a narrow gravel pull-off about 2 hours north of where I lived. The area didn't have marked campsites. It was public land, the kind of place used by hunters and a few backpackers who didn't like crowds. The map I had printed showed an old logging road that curved deep into the forest, eventually ending near a stream that emptied into a small lake. I decided I'd follow that and find a spot near water. The first hour of the hike was easy. The air was cool, a dry cold that smelled faintly of pine and dirt. The leaves had just begun to turn, so the ground was carpeted with brittle orange and brown. The trail wasn't really a trail anymore, just a faint depression between trees. I remember noticing deep tire ruts hardened into the mud, like ghosts of heavy machinery that hadn't been there in years. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sound of cars faded completely. I could hear the small things, the snapping of twigs under my boots, the distant drip of water, the hollow creak of trees moving in the wind. The forest had that strange layered stillness where sound travels weirdly. I could hear what I thought was water from far away, then nothing for minutes. By the time I reached the stream, the light was dropping. I found a flat piece of ground just above the bank where the trees opened slightly, and set up my tent. The dirt there was soft but firm, covered in needles. I set up my camp chair, unpacked, and gathered wood. It was routine, almost calming. Once the fire started, I felt the warmth move over my legs and everything felt right. That first night was uneventful, though I barely slept. The sounds were new. Every snap made my eyes open. I could hear animals moving, small, quick rustles and the slow shuffle of something heavier now and then. It wasn't threatening, just unfamiliar. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to complete silence. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just stillness so deep that it felt wrong. My heart started racing for no reason. I told myself to relax, rolled over, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning was calm. Mist hung over the stream and the air was damp. I boiled water for coffee and walked a bit along the bank, following the stream until it widened into a dark pool before curling out of sight. The mud near the edge was thick and I noticed fresh footprints there. They weren't animal tracks, they looked human, boot prints, large ones. Maybe someone else had come through recently, I thought. It wasn't illegal to camp out there, but it still made me uneasy. That day I explored further along the logging road, trying to find where it ended. About 2 miles in, I found a small clearing full of rusted metal scraps, remnants of old machines. There was an overturned engine block, a broken wheel, and piles of decayed boards. It looked like some forgotten work site from decades ago. The forest had almost swallowed it up. I stood there a while, trying to imagine the noise and movement that had once been there. Now there was nothing but rot and silence. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. No distant voices, no vehicles, nothing. The isolation felt heavier the longer I stayed. Back at camp that evening, I built a bigger fire and cooked dinner, trying to push the uneasy feeling away. As darkness fell, I noticed something strange, no insect noise again. The same silence from the night before. It came suddenly, like a switch flipped. One moment there was the soft hum of crickets, and the next it was just gone. I stared into the fire, listening. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. The shadows looked deeper, and the space beyond the light of the fire felt infinite. I couldn't see movement, but I could feel that something was out there. I told myself to stay calm, that animals sometimes cause the woods to quiet down. Maybe a predator nearby. I poked the fire, fed it another log, and tried to focus on the flames. After a while, the sounds returned, faintly at first. I relaxed a little, but I still had that tight feeling in my chest. I slept only in short bursts that night. Around midnight, I heard something across the stream. Not footsteps exactly, more like a soft dragging through leaves, then silence again. I held still inside my tent, barely breathing. The sound didn't come closer, but it didn't go away either. I stayed awake until dawn lightened the tent walls. The next morning, I went to check the other side of the stream. The mud there was disturbed, like something heavy had moved through during the night. The boot prints from before were deeper now, overlapping in strange angles. They led away from the water and up the slope into the woods. The spacing was odd, uneven, like someone was limping or dragging something. For the rest of the day, I tried not to think about it. I hiked, collected more wood, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I caught myself turning around often, scanning the trees. I thought I saw something once, a flash of movement behind a thick trunk, but it could have been anything. I forced myself to focus on practical tasks because stopping to think made the fear worse. That night, I built the biggest fire yet. The flames threw light far into the clearing, making the surrounding trees glow orange. I sat close, facing outward, my back to the tent. I didn't eat much. I just listened. The forest stayed quiet again for long stretches, longer than before. Then I heard it, not far away this time, the distinct sound of a stick breaking under weight. Slow, deliberate. Then another. The direction was hard to judge. It echoed faintly, but it was close, maybe just beyond the first line of trees. I kept my eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing moved, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. The sound stopped completely. I waited, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Minutes passed and there was nothing. I finally stood, pretending to busy myself with the fire, but really I was scanning the dark edges again and again. When I finally went to my tent, I zipped it tight and kept my flashlight in my hand. I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something new. A faint metallic clinking sound, irregular like metal tapping against something hard. It came from the direction of the stream. Then the dragging sound again, slow, scraping, pausing between movements. I lay there frozen, every muscle tense. I didn't move until dawn. When I stepped outside, everything looked untouched except for one thing. The small pile of firewood I had stacked beside the tent was gone. Every piece. I looked around confused, thinking maybe an animal dragged it off, but wood doesn't just vanish. I followed faint impressions in the dirt where the wood had been. They led back toward the stream and ended there. Across the water I could see faint prints again heading up the hill. I decided I was done. Whatever was out there, human or animal, it wasn't right. I packed as fast as I could. The forest felt too still, like it was waiting. When I started walking back toward my truck, I had that crawling feeling again, like eyes were following me from behind. I didn't stop to check. About halfway back, I saw something that made me stop cold. To the right of the trail, a small cluster of trees had been stripped of their bark in long vertical lines. Fresh pale wood underneath. At the base of one tree was my missing firewood, stacked neatly. Not scattered, not chewed. Stacked like someone had arranged it on purpose. I just stood there staring. The wood was clean, dry, perfectly aligned, almost ceremonial. There was no reason for it to be there. I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise. The woods were silent again, and I could hear my own breathing echo in my ears. I forced myself to keep walking. Every minute felt stretched out, every step too loud. By the time I reached the pull-off, the sight of my truck felt unreal, like I'd been gone for weeks instead of days. I threw everything into the back without caring how it landed and drove off, watching the tree line in my mirrors until the road curved away. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Only then did I let myself breathe properly. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. When I finally looked in the back of the truck, I realized one of my bags, the one I kept my camp hatchet in, was missing. I hadn't left it behind. I was certain I had packed it. I didn't go back. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every small sound at night made me jolt awake. I kept replaying everything in my head. The footprints, the sounds, the missing wood, the stack by the stripped trees. It all pointed to someone being there. Someone who didn't want me around but didn't attack either. Just watched. Waited. I thought about how far in I had been, how hidden that area was. No roads, no houses for miles. Whoever it was, they lived out there, or stayed long enough to know every inch of those woods. I kept wondering how long they had been watching me before I noticed. Months later, when winter came, I saw a short article online about hikers finding strange tree markings in that same region. Stripped bark, stacked wood, and in one case, a small pit filled with ashes and bones. Animals, supposedly. The Forest Service dismissed it as the work of someone squatting deep in the woods. They didn't look into it further. I never went camping alone again. I went camping alone in early September, thinking it would be peaceful before the cold started to set in. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, somewhere quiet where I wouldn't see anyone else for days. I drove up a narrow dirt road that wound through thick pine forest, branches brushing the side of my truck as I climbed higher. It was the kind of road that felt forgotten, rutted and uneven with moss growing in the middle of the tracks. I passed no cars, no cabins, no signs of anyone living out there. That was exactly what I wanted. Just space, silence, and the woods. When I finally stopped, the forest around me felt still in a strange way. There was no wind. Even the birds were quiet. The air smelled like wet soil and pine sap, and everything had that faint dampness that lingers in high mountain forests. I parked beside a clearing that sloped slightly downward, just big enough for my tent and a fire ring. A narrow stream ran maybe 30 yards away. Behind a wall of ferns and deadfall, I set up camp slowly, making sure everything was perfect. The tent facing the stream, the food sealed, firewood stacked in a neat pile. It was one of those warm, golden afternoons where time felt slow. The sun dropped behind the ridge earlier than I expected, though, and the woods darkened fast. By the time I lit the fire, the trees around the clearing were already black silhouettes. That first night was fine. I sat by the fire, cooked a small meal, and listened to the occasional branch snapping in the forest. That sound never bothered me much. Forests are full of animals that move at night. Still, there was something about how far those sounds carried that made me uneasy. It wasn't loud, it was distant, but every time something shifted out there, I caught myself glancing up. When I finally crawled into the tent, the silence hit harder. Without the fire crackling, I realized how dark it really was. I couldn't see my own hand unless I turned on my flashlight. I laid there listening, the soft gurgle of the stream, a few insects, then nothing. It was too quiet. I remember rolling over a few times trying to sleep and then hearing what sounded like a single faint footstep. Just one. It came from somewhere behind my tent near the stream. I froze and listened. Nothing after that. I told myself it was probably a branch falling, or maybe a raccoon stepping on dry leaves. I kept still for a long time, then finally fell asleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. I walked down to the stream, filled a bottle with water, and noticed fresh impressions in the mud near the bank. Not clear footprints, but something that had pressed down the soft soil in a long shape, like a boot heel dragged slightly. I crouched and stared at it for a minute, telling myself it could have been my own print from yesterday. But it was facing toward the tent, not away. That day, I hiked a few miles deeper into the woods. The trail was faint, if you could even call it a trail. Fallen logs, patches of ferns, uneven ground. The forest felt endless. I didn't see a single person, but at one point I found an old fire ring made of stones, half collapsed with a few rusted tin cans scattered nearby. It looked abandoned for years. I sat there for a while, eating, just listening to the quiet again. The air started to shift around mid-afternoon. The forest went silent again, the same way it had the day before. Not even birds. I didn't like that. You spend enough time in the woods and you start to feel when something's off. It wasn't just silence, it was the kind that feels heavy, like the trees themselves are holding their breath. I decided to head back early. When I reached my camp, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The firewood pile I'd stacked neatly was scattered, like someone had kicked it apart. I stood there staring at it, trying to think if maybe an animal had done it. But animals don't usually toss wood around like that. My tent flap was closed though, and nothing seemed missing. I forced myself to shrug it off. That night I built the fire higher than before. The light pushed deeper into the trees, but it also made the edges of the clearing feel darker. I kept glancing at those edges while eating, like something was standing just outside the light. At one point I swore I saw movement, a dark shape between the trees, but when I stared directly at it, it was gone. I sat there for a long time, fire crackling, the hair on the back of my neck standing up for no reason I could explain. Eventually I put out the fire and went into the tent. Laying there, I could hear the wind picking up now, soft at first, brushing through the trees. I started to relax, listening to that. Then I heard another sound. It was faint but clear enough to know it wasn't the wind. It was breathing. Slow, uneven breathing coming from just outside the tent wall. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tightening. I could feel my heartbeat against the sleeping bag. The breathing continued for maybe 5-6 seconds. Then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't even open my eyes. I laid there until the sky started to lighten and the birds returned. When I finally crawled out, the first thing I did was check the ground. There were fresh impressions again, this time clearer. Boot prints. Not mine, larger. Heavy tread. Someone had been there. That realization hit me like ice. I packed up fast, every noise in the forest making me jump. But when I started to leave, I saw something farther down the slope, maybe 50 yards away, near the trees. Something that looked like a tarp. I don't even know why I went to check. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tarp. It was an old sleeping bag, half buried under leaves. It was dirty, faded red, and there were torn clothes scattered around it. I picked up a shirt. It was stiff, like it had been left out through rain after rain. But what caught me was the smell. Old rot, like something that had been wet too long. I looked around and saw more, small piles of trash, a dented metal cup, a broken lantern. Someone had lived there. Not recently, but long enough to leave a trace. I turned back toward my camp, and that's when I noticed something else. A faint trail leading uphill behind my tent. I hadn't seen it before, but now that I was looking for it, it was there. Flattened grass, a narrow line disappearing into the trees. I followed it slowly, just a few yards. The trees closed in tight overhead, the air cooler. I could see where branches had been cut, small areas cleared. Someone had been using that spot, maybe watching my camp from the woods. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't stay another night. I packed everything in a hurry and started back down the mountain road. The whole drive out, I kept checking my mirrors. The feeling that someone was behind me wouldn't go away. Halfway down, I stopped near a bend where there was a small clearing and looked back up the slope. From there, I could see the faint line of smoke rising through the trees, right from the area where my camp had been. Someone was there after I left. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over at a gas station, still shaking. I told myself it was fine, that I'd just been paranoid. But when I went to grab a drink inside, I saw a bulletin board by the door with a few missing person flyers. One caught my eye. Someone who'd vanished last fall while camping in the same area I'd just been. The photo showed a man maybe in his 40s wearing a dark jacket. I stared at it for a long time. There was something about the face that looked familiar. Then I realized why. The shape of his boot in the picture, heavy tread, same pattern I'd seen by my tent. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep right. I'd wake up thinking I heard that slow breathing again. I threw away most of my camping gear, couldn't even look at it without my chest tightening. Every time I drove past a forest line, I'd glance toward the trees, half expecting to see movement. Months later, I read a short local article online about an old campsite discovered deep in those woods. Bones found near a sleeping bag, identified as a hiker who'd gone missing 2 years before. They said he might have died from exposure or injury, but I knew that wasn't right. There was something else out there. Someone else. I still think about the prints, the breathing, and the smoke that rose after I left. Whoever was up there knew I'd been there. Maybe they'd been watching for a long time. And the worst part is I'll never know if they're still there waiting for whoever sets up camp next. I went camping alone that weekend because I wanted a break from everything. I had been working too many hours, barely sleeping, barely talking to anyone, and I just needed silence. I picked a place deep inside a national forest, several hours from any town. I had been there once before with a group, but this time I wanted to go alone. I packed everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid, flashlight, knife, and my small camping stove. I also carried a map and compass because cell service was unreliable that far out. It was late September, and the weather had started cooling down. The air had that sharp chill that makes every sound seem clearer. I left early in the morning so I could reach the spot by mid-afternoon. The drive took longer than expected because the dirt roads were in rough shape. Every bump rattled the truck and trees leaned so close over the trail that branches scraped the sides. I remember feeling isolated even before I parked. I parked at a small clearing where the road ended. From there, I had to hike about 1.5 miles to reach the spot I wanted, near a small stream that ran down from a ridge. The forest was thick, mostly pine, and it smelled damp and earthy. The sound of the wind through the trees was soft but constant. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No engines, no voices, no music. Just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the distant trickle of water. When I reached the spot, it looked exactly how I remembered it. Flat ground, a few old fire pits from previous campers, and enough space for one tent. The stream was only a short walk downhill. I unpacked everything, set up the tent, and started gathering some firewood before dark. It took longer than I thought because most of the branches were damp from recent rain. By sunset, the fire was going strong. I ate a simple meal, just canned chili heated over the flames, and sat there for a while listening to the forest. The night came fast. 1 minute there was still some blue in the sky, and the next it was pitch black. The firelight only reached a few feet before fading into complete darkness. I felt safe, though. It was calm. The only sounds were the occasional snapping branch from small animals moving through the brush. It was around midnight when I first noticed something strange. I was sitting in the tent with my headlamp on, reading, when I heard a heavy rustling somewhere behind the tent. It wasn't a small animal sound. It was deeper, heavier, like something large moving carefully through the trees. I turned off the headlamp and sat completely still. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, so it was nearly dark. I listened. The sound came again. Slow steps. I could hear leaves crunching, twigs snapping under weight. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk. But it didn't sound like hooves, it sounded like footsteps. The spacing between the steps was deliberate, slow, cautious. I felt every hair on my body stand up. I waited for the sound to pass, but it didn't. It stayed there behind my tent for what felt like several minutes. Then it moved slightly to the side, as if circling. I held my breath, trying to see if I could catch any glimpse through the thin tent fabric. Nothing. Only the faint outline of trees against the dim sky. Eventually the sound stopped. I didn't hear it walk away. It just faded. I stayed awake most of the night listening. Every now and then I thought I heard faint crunches again, far off. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, or maybe the trees shifting in the wind. By around 3 a.m. I finally dozed off. When I woke up, everything seemed normal. Morning light, the smell of damp earth, birds calling. I stepped out of the tent and stretched. But when I turned around, I noticed footprints near the back of my campsite. They were faint but visible in the soft ground. They were human, barefoot. I just stared at them for a while. They came from the woods, stopped about 10 feet from my tent, then turned back into the trees. The ground was slightly wet from dew, so the prints were fresh from the night before. My chest tightened as I realized someone had been walking barefoot out there, quietly watching. I packed my food back into the sealed container and tried to shake it off. Maybe a hiker got lost. Maybe some weird local. I didn't want to overthink it, but the thought stayed with me all day. I couldn't stop scanning the trees whenever I moved around camp. I went fishing at the stream that afternoon, trying to relax. The water was clear, and I could see trout darting under the surface. For a while, I almost forgot about the footprints, but at some point I looked up the ridge and saw something that froze me in place. There was a figure standing halfway up the slope, partly hidden behind a tree. I couldn't see the face, just the outline of a person, still and silent, watching me. I blinked and the shape was gone. I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe my eyes played tricks with the light between the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been seen. When I got back to camp, I noticed something else. My tent flap was open. I always zip it closed when I leave. Inside, nothing seemed missing, but my sleeping bag was unrolled, and my backpack was moved slightly. I knew I hadn't left it that way. That night, I built the fire larger. I sat close to it, keeping the light strong. I wanted to see anything that came near. I stayed up until almost dawn. The woods were completely silent after midnight, not even insects. It was that unnatural silence that makes you realize something else might be listening too. At some point I heard the same slow movement again, this time from the other side of camp. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark but showed nothing. Still, the sound stopped immediately, as if whoever or whatever it was had frozen in place. I turned the light off again and listened. A few minutes later, I heard a single soft sound like a quiet exhale, coming from the direction of the trees. That sound hit me harder than anything. It wasn't an animal. It was someone breathing. I stayed completely still until the sound faded. When the sky started to lighten, I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up as fast as I could. As I took down the tent, I noticed something carved into one of the trees near where I'd camped. It looked like a rough line or symbol. Nothing fancy, just a deep slash across the bark. It wasn't there when I arrived. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me turn my head. I kept thinking I was being followed, though I never saw anyone. When I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, I almost ran the last few steps. That's when I saw it. My truck's driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it. Inside, everything was tossed around. Glove box open, papers everywhere. Nothing valuable was missing, but my camping knife was gone. Just gone. I stood there looking around the empty clearing. The woods were silent again. The air was still. I loaded my gear and got in the truck, locking the doors immediately. As I turned the key, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Far back down the path between the trees, there was a figure again. Just standing there, barely visible in the early morning light. It didn't move. I hit the gas and drove out of there fast, not looking back again. For weeks after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept picturing the footprints, the open tent, the breathing in the dark. I checked news sites for anything about missing people or strange activity in that forest, but there was nothing. No reports, no warnings. A month later, I went back, not to camp, but to check if I could find any sign of what happened. I parked in the same clearing and followed the same path, though every step made me uneasy. The forest felt different, colder, emptier. When I reached the stream area, I saw that someone had made a small shelter out of sticks and an old tarp, maybe 100 feet from where I had camped. Inside it were bits of trash, a can opener, and torn clothing. Whoever had been out there had been living there for some time. I didn't stay long. As I turned to leave, I noticed one last thing. On a tree near the shelter, there were dozens of small carvings, lines, symbols, scratches, like someone marking days or keeping count. The bark was shredded. I left and never went back to that forest again. Every time I go camping now, even in busy campgrounds, I can't fall asleep until I've checked around the tent at least 3 times. I can't handle total silence anymore. I always keep some small noise going. Wind chime, small speaker, anything to make sure I'll notice if the sound stops again like it did that night. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was just someone living out there watching, moving silently in the dark. And I still think sometimes about that breathing, how close it sounded and how long they must have been standing there behind the trees,